I learn Torah. I've written a number of books on Torah, but somehow I find the time for all these things. Baruch Hashem. I've been around 10 years involved in real estate in one form or other. My company, JS Realty, has been going for about 7 years here, based, as she said, in Ramat Beit Shemesh. I've also been involved up north as well, but that's another story. JS Realty, that's Jonathan. It used to be Jonathan Shooter. Over the years, my wife joins me. Her name's Shoshana, so instead of Jonathan Shooter, it was Jonathan and Shoshana. So anyway, that's how it became JS. And Baruch Hashem, I'm involved in a business where I supply essentially housing as a basic, obviously a very fundamental need for people, and seeing them to a destination after what often can end up as a search, and following through the process from A to Z or A to Z, and seeing how sort of happy and what a difference it makes in their lives. So I get a lot of satisfaction from that, and Baruch Hashem, I think some of them are satisfied with me, hopefully all of them. I'd like to speak essentially about 6 main topics tonight. I'll just run through them very briefly. Number one, I'm actually going to start with the corona situation as such, meaning how that has affected what's going on here. Number two, we'll talk about the role of an agent. Number three, the process. Number four, the costs involved in buying property. Number five, why buy in Eretz Yisrael at all, in terms of investment, not just for living. And number six, buying on paper versus buying something existing. The case, a little bit about that process, and the case for and against. So without any further ado, let's go straight into the corona situation, which I think is really quite defining of what's going on here in Eretz Yisrael at the moment. I don't know exactly how many people are from in Eretz Yisrael currently or are abroad, but hopefully this will get a bit of understanding what's going on. Everyone knows, obviously it's hard to, everyone knows what's been going on in the last couple of months. Everyone should have a refuah shalem of those that need it, and one way or the other, this is now very much out there, especially in Ramat Beit Shemesh and around the world, obviously. And as things were grinding to a halt before Pesach, there were a number of deals we were involved in, and some buyers got cold feet because of these times of uncertainty, going into lockdowns, etc. And myself and any other entrepreneur were kind of wondering how on earth is this going to affect what we're doing. So anyway, we had essentially a quiet Pesach, and as I said, deals kind of were dropped. And this all started actually, I remember getting out of bed literally the Yisru Chag after Pesach, and looking at my phone, and there was a text message from a customer involved in a deal that had been waiting for after Pesach. And the text message said, well, in light of the fact that there's 30 million unemployed in America and no one's going to be buying any properties, maybe the Kablan will drop the price by 500,000 shekels. For me, that was one of these moments where I'm like, oh, okay. Is that really a taste of what's coming? I don't know. So I did a little bit of research, speak to fellow professionals in the field, and the news was not all bad as such. I mean, I was told one sort of person heavily involved said when things get back to normal, the realty is going to be the first thing that's going to pick up. I had a chat with one of my sort of lawyer friends, what's going on, and she says, yeah, maybe you should, why don't you become a teacher? I thought, okay, maybe, I don't know. I remember then a week or two later, I was somehow involved in I think it was before Shabbos, I was involved in like 6 potential positions. And by Sunday, it turned into 1.5 positions as, people, just their situation's changing. And a lot of our customers, maybe are tour guides or this, that, and that, they just can't do it without being able to show incomes as such. Fortunately, though, that 1.5 deals, actually both of them went through in the end, but that's another story. So so was this customer right? Were the prices going to crash by 500,000 shekels or not? The answer, in short, was that the kablanim who were building on paper are not dropping their prices in any significant way, if they're dropping at all. They paid a lot of money for the land. The margins that kablans make are not as high as we are led to believe. We may have seen some slight readjustment, but nevertheless, nothing that sort of prompted any big rush as such. Now, what about the second-hand apartments? People aren't working and can't pay their mortgages, then surely they need to sell. The answer is that the banks have essentially allowed people to defer mortgage payments, adding them on to their loans at the end as such, and therefore they're not under pressure to, one day they will be, but the point is, we haven't seen any dramatic drop in prices. That's really the situation on the ground. There were statistics that came out. Sales in Israel were very low, obviously during the month of March, April, and even May. However, as of now, they're basically back to the pre-corona levels. So basically, after that text message, within about 2-3 weeks, we were getting a lot of phone calls from their buyers. A lot of people still had plans. They wanted to move to Ramat Beit Shemesh. And then within the last couple of weeks, something happened, which, as you can hear, I'm British, and I'm not massively involved with customers from America. Most of my customers are local, and suddenly we start getting an avalanche of phone calls, emails, etc. from America, that a lot of people are interested. They've got to buy a property now. Literally, I've heard of deals where someone just called up a kablan, said, "I'm taking that," just sort of sent over what he needed. And okay, I'm not saying that's necessarily how it has to be, but I'm just saying this is indicative of the fact that these are not normal times, and on the contrary, the rush to Eretz Yisrael seems to be rather on the up, but perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later. Baruch Hashem, there's many transactions. Yesterday was Erev Rosh Chodesh. We saw 2 deals go signed for Rosh Chodesh. There's other deals that are pending till after Tisha B'Av, Mitzvah Hashem. Lawyers, I can barely get hold of some of them, and they're busy. So we're basically back to where we were. Had prices fallen? The real answer. Now, even though the statistics sometimes show a minus 0.8% drop, but overall, we have. I'm interested in what's happening in Ramat Beit Shemesh, in Yerushalayim even, and I know that not that I'm based that much in Yerushalayim, but I hear that they're very busy there as well. Ramat Beit Shemesh, which we'll talk about a bit later on, is for various reasons a very in-demand area, and we're not really seeing significant drops in price, and who knows, people even sometimes shooting for higher prices. So we'll come back to that. We'll come back to Ramat Beit Shemesh shortly. In short, I've been telling people for the last year as such, whoever's liquid and can buy there were cottages available for under 3 million in Aleph. I was telling any customer that would listen, just grab whatever there is, because these things don't come up. And now when they do come up, they want more than 3 million. So it's just how it goes. There's an excess demand. We'll talk about that again a bit later on. Therefore, the forecast is, we're not sure exactly when the borders are opening. They're opening up to Yeshiva Bachrim soon, and which kind of is a sign that at some point, they're talking about after the Chagim, we're expecting a lot of people are going to be coming to Eretz Yisrael. Some are buying through videos and photos and sending people to look at things. And, unfortunately for buyers, what it does spell is it's essentially becoming, it's always been, I would say it's fairly true to say, anyone with a decent property in Ramat Beit Shemesh Aleph, can sometimes have 2 or 3 bidders on a place, sometimes if it's really something in demand. Just for myself, not I'm saying this to show off, but just today I must have got maybe 6 or 7 or 8, I don't even know, I haven't had a chance to even deal with them all, but what I call new customers as such, wanting some kind of information or whatever it is. And, this is a time of year that's typically quiet as we sort of are in the 3 weeks and as such. But if anything, it's the exact opposite. So I hope that gives a bit of perspective what's going on. That's the part 1 about the corona situation. Okay, let's move on to the second topic. I hope that's useful so far. Yeah, okay, another inquiry. Okay, what is the role of an agent? So in short, nothing stopping anyone buying a property privately. One can ask around, one can knock on the door, one can make a phone call, and people have bought properties without agents, so it certainly can be done. So what does an agent do? Where does he add value? And what's the point of us, really? So let's go through some of these points. Number one, there's something called local knowledge. What's actually going on in the area? Where is construction taking place? If I buy a property here, what's going to be built opposite? What do I need to know that I might not know otherwise? Just tonight I was explaining to someone about, he didn't quite realize that there's a certain property, well, he knew the property for sale, but there's some kind of hall being built kind of quite opposite it. He wouldn't necessarily know that, and therefore we have the knowledge kind of what's going on. Our job is to learn the area, to learn the apartments. I know that, without going ahead of myself, I think I know the layouts of many of the apartments or most of the buildings in Ramat Beit Shemesh, even without seeing them. There's certain configurations, each couple built differently. So I have a fairly good idea there. Pricing, let's put it like this. Typically, when a seller's selling on a, what you might call one of these sort of free websites, emails, Facebook, very often they're shooting for a higher price, because if the whole thing, they don't want the agent, so they also want a much higher price as well. There's something called a serious seller. This is a big pitfall, unfortunately, in, I don't know, I'm speaking now for here, but I'm sure it's around the world. Sometimes you have people who are sort of shooting at for a high price, and if someone comes along with a high price, our job is really to try and get to the sort of cutting edge of the market, whereby we want to know what you might call the serious sellers as such, that our customers can get a fair deal, sometimes a good deal, but at least a fair deal based on the the individual specs of the properties. One needs to know what were the past sales of similar apartments. Now, the data can be very misleading because there's just different ways of measuring apartments. The price per meter can be very confusing. How big is an apartment? There's at least 4 different ways of measuring an apartment. And so if anyone asks me, how big is this apartment? I'm going to tell you, well, that's a very complex question. There's about 4 different ways, but I'm going to sort of educate you, hopefully, to the information that you need to know. The best realtors essentially focus not on the whole of Israel, but actually focusing on a specific area. The Beit Shemesh area has grown very big, and it's quite enough to deal with. Just whether even Ramat Beit Shemesh has even Aleph has different areas as such that are quite hard to cover absolutely everything. Essentially, also with agents, much of what goes on is essentially underneath the market. I have to say to everyone, I'll probably lose a lot of friends over this, but I always apologize. My website is not always up to date, and other people's websites also not up to date. A lot of the business is just on the ground. Sometimes I'm not saying this always happens, but even before I put a sign up, we can have a buyer there as such. So I know there's people who are angry. I hope they're not angry with me, but are frustrated at the websites because they sit in America and that's all they have. They're browsing all the websites as such. But really, when they're in touch with an agent, it's kind of, you want to hit the property that hasn't sort of been sitting around, till I've, managed to upload it to the website as such. So in other words, when a hot property comes onto the market, and when I say hot, the one that meets exactly what you're looking for, and there's probably going to be competition if it's such a good property, it's kind of good to be sort of first and ready as such with that information. Walking through the process, unless you've done it before, it can be somewhat confusing, somewhat annoying. There are lots of annoyances that can come up. Every deal, I must tell you, brings its own what should we say, complications as such, not necessarily because of me, but because we have sellers and their various needs and understandings and misunderstanding and and then we have the conditions of the apartment as such. Basically, a realtor should be able to explain and walk you through these processes. Someone put a question in, how do I not get ripped off by Israelis? Which I understand the question. I think the answer is that when someone knows what they're doing, then there's nothing. I wouldn't say every Israeli cannot be dealt with. I think I've done business with all sorts of every nationality, and I wouldn't say Israelis are worse than anyone else. There's a certain, often the problem is lack of communication, lack of understanding, and lack of clarity of what the potential deal is and what it does include and what it doesn't include. When everything is put out on the table, then one is going to have a much better chance of success. A decent realtor should be able to negotiate for you as such, as essentially, if I'm on essentially to get the best price that is humanly possible. We protect from essentially, there's a lot of emotions that can go on either side. Last night or 2 nights ago, a realtor that I'm working in conjunction with was for 4 hours in a very heated discussion with a seller. I'm here representing the buyer in this one, and my buyer doesn't have to know all the details that went on, but I just present him in my English way as such what he needs to know for this particular deal as such. And obviously a realtor that has a reputation. The business is all about reputation. If you've heard good things about a realtor, then that's probably good. So that's I hope that's a bit more clarity. I hope I'm sure some of these points may be obvious, some may be new, some may need more further clarity, and maybe I've missed out some points, but that's a little bit about the role of an agent. Let's talk now about the process of buying an apartment. The first thing I want to say is, the first word, or 3 words, is as follows: please be realistic with your expectations. I had someone from Far Rockaway, I don't think he's here tonight. He says to me he lives in a 1,000-meter house and he has a huge, in-ground pool. So what's the nearest thing I can get him in Beit Shemesh? And I said to him, I'm not so sure I have much to offer you in that range. Typically, the bigger houses are barely through 270 to 80 meters. One can build one's own house and maybe get 500 meters. And even then, he won't have the land around it for the swimming pool that he wants. Nevertheless, since then, he's sort of got a bit real with it. But why am I saying this point? Because expectations, people think, Ramat Beit Shemesh is an area of green pastures and massive gardens and and every sort of lots of space between the buildings, between the apartments. The answer is it's not like that. Ramat Beit Shemesh 20 years ago was a cheap place. When we moved here, nearly about 20 years ago, they were giving grants to sort of encourage people to move to Ramat Beit Shemesh. Since then, it's become absolutely the center of things, and is not considered like an area they need to promote anymore. So therefore, what ideally one has to work out what is one's budget. That we're going to do shortly with Aaron Morgan, because when one works out a budget and realizes, okay, these are all the costs I need to know, and if something's worth it, perhaps I'll put in a bit more. Maybe these are the costs I want to renovate as such, and this is the mortgage I can get. It basically comes to a figure. And basically, the realtor can hopefully tell him what would be the best thing one can get for that figure. So just saying, one has to be kind of realize that Ramat Beit Shemesh is it's a very nice place, but 1,000-meter houses and Olympic swimming pools might prove a tough one. So therefore, ideally, before one starts shopping, one should. I think all of us would agree in the realty business that speaking to a mortgage broker, if one's taking a mortgage, that is, if one's a cash buyer, that's a different story. But if one is taking a mortgage, to know exactly that one either gets qualified, sometimes it can be what we call gvuli, that means borderline. There are such cases. It depends obviously on incomes. or just be confident from the mortgage broker that yes, your story is going to work. If you know the story is going to work, then a good man like Aaron will certainly get a mortgage within a couple of days, and one will be good to go. The point is, being in the position of strength as a buyer is very important, because, like I said, there can be competition. If it's what I call a good property, an A property, there will be competition, and therefore, when it comes to presenting the offer to the seller doesn't want to hear that, well, they're selling a house in America and they're definitely going to have the money within 3 weeks. No, like, is there a buyer in America, and is it already at lawyers, and when can the seller expect his money? So that's the second point within the process, to sort of get qualified and not lose a good apartment because one hasn't sort of worked out the finances beforehand. Okay, so we've said knowing one's budget. And always it's sort of, I see a lot that people come along with a budget, sort of X, and then they say, well, if it's something really good, I'd go to Y. So I understand that, sort of lachatchila, but the evet sort of thing. I really want to stick here, but for something's really good, then I would go to this. So that's a little tip there. So basically, the process goes: you go with the realtor, or you get the pictures and the videos, or you send a relative if you're from America, have them walk through an apartment. I personally, although I have seen people buy, I have seen people walk in and say, I'm taking it. My usual suspicion is that, they're sort of a little too hasty, and I prefer that they actually come back the second time before we get into negotiations. I'm not saying it hasn't never worked, but typically it's good to have a second walkthrough, and to just make sure one understands the apartment, how it is, what it isn't, and then, in other words, the people who are too quick, it can sometimes be they haven't necessarily thought it out properly. Do it calmly, with Yishuv Adas, but at the same time not losing the apartment as well. So basically, the process: you find the apartment, we need to then put in an offer. In Israel, we do not do an inspection before putting in an offer, because the inspection I'm talking about here an engineering report. The engineering report can cost about, let's just say, 2,000 shekels. There's cheaper ways of doing it. That's another discussion. Excuse me. So we agree on a price. With that acceptance of the price, essentially, the seller has not legally committed to anything. Legally committed is obviously the signed contract. Nevertheless, there's something called acting in good faith. We're Jewish. We are meant to treat each other as we'd like to be treated ourselves in business. If an offer is accepted, the person should be given the time to close. And therefore, the next stage would, if he wants to, is to bring in an engineer. Excuse me, I've been talking for a while. The engineer's report usually takes a couple of days. The main purpose of the engineer's report is to see, are there any big problems? In any second-hand apartment, there'll always be small problems. And what the engineer's report does, it basically quantifies the product that one is buying. In other words, here I see an apartment, it's been lived in for 20 years. What exactly is urgent to fix? What is not urgent to fix? Stupid things, there'll be, absolutely plenty. But okay, that's the idea of the report. So we've agreed on the price, we've done the inspection. The lawyers then need to get involved, although the agent should be able to tell you, is there any issue with the title? Is there any taxes that the seller has to pay? Because sometimes the seller doesn't know that, and his agent should be telling him that, so that he goes into the deal as an informed seller. The lawyers therefore proceed to, part of negotiations. So just rewind a second. Part of the negotiations is not only about price. Negotiations is about terms of payment. In other words, usually with a contract in Israel, any self-respecting lawyer will want a minimum of 10% of the contract at the signing, and there'll be some kind of schedule of payments. Not that I'm so familiar with how it works in America and in England, but essentially in Israel, the closing is at the beginning, not at the end. And that means one's worked out a schedule of payments. It's not 10, I mean, it can be 10% at the beginning and 90% at the end. But typically the seller needs more money in order to make his purchase where he's going. And somehow part of negotiations is a schedule of payments. So we've got price, schedule of payments, and when is what's called the pinui, when are we moving into the apartment? That's obviously the buyer needs to make plans and the seller needs to make plans. So those are the three things that go into the offer. Like I said, inspection and lawyers. We need to know before the inspection that there's no serious legal issue. But other than that, essentially, once all that's done, the lawyer essentially takes care of the job of making sure that you're protected legally wise. So essentially, any deal in Eretz Yisrael is basically a combination. Mainly, I mentioned the engineer, but I see that more as a peripheral intrinsic matter. But the deal is happening as a combination of the agent, the lawyer, and the mortgage broker. The mortgage broker needs to be in contact with the lawyer, in contact with the bank, and making sure that that all ties in together when we need that to happen. And essentially, the agent, in an interesting way, turns from sort of starting off as some kind of show sales, showman as such, showing apartments, then transforming into negotiating. And then by the time it's gone off to lawyers, the agent's role essentially is more like a project manager, kind of overseeing that everyone's actually moving and doing the jobs that they need to do, and just sort of tying it all together. So that's that concludes the third section of what I wanted to say. Let's talk a bit about the costs of buying an apartment in Israel. We had some good news within the last week. Those that are in America buying purely as an investment were subject to an 8% purchase tax from the first shekel. There were reasons why they did that a few years ago. Try and cool the real estate market and essentially discourage people from owning more than one house, and discouraging all the foreign investment. Nevertheless, they've decided that that policy has had its day, and therefore at some point are going to be dropping from 8% to 5%. 5% is if you're buying as a foreign buyer, meaning you live in America or wherever, and you do not plan on making Aliyah. If you do plan on making Aliyah, I forget whether it's 1 year or 2 years, within 1 or 2 years, you can either pay the tax and get it back, or maybe you can even get out of it completely. A lawyer can tell you exactly these things do change, and subject to how much the lawyer can deal with the tax authorities. But anyway, so just putting that on the table. But anyway, either way, it's a good thing, I think, for everyone that the purchase tax has gone down to 5% for, number one, for foreign buyers, number two, for people in Israel who own one apartment already and are buying an investment apartment. People who are buying a first apartment and who live in Israel, or who are making Aliyah and therefore can view themselves as Israeli within the year or so. Essentially, the first 1.6 or 1.7, again, also one of these figures that sort of bounces around, but the first 1.6 to 1.7, I'm talking shekels, obviously, is exempt completely from purchase tax. The other costs one needs to know about: agent's fee, they usually charge 2% plus VAT. Lawyers usually charge very often it's the standard 0.5% plus VAT. Some lawyers charge 1%, some lawyers are cheaper, and that's kind of how it goes. Mortgage broker, Aaron can tell you a bit about that. There's certain bank fees. The cost of the inspection, as I said, can be about 2,000 shekels. Could be cheaper for a smaller apartment. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is when one buys an apartment, what are the costs of making it livable? Typically, someone coming, sort of making Aliyah. So let's just take the example of Ramat Beit Shemesh. Most apartments are coming on 20 years old. Very often, the families live there, even if they renovated it once. But 15 years later, it's not necessarily in prime condition anymore. So therefore, it's time for an overhaul as such. The basic ballpark figures are, for example, doing a new kitchen can be anything between 30 to 50,000 shekels. If you have a huge kitchen and you do it totally fancy, it can be 100,000 shekels. It just depends what you're doing. Bathrooms are basically 20 to 25 to 30,000 shekels. relaying a whole floor can be about 30,000 shekels in an apartment. These days, they don't rip up the floor, they just overlay the tiles on the apartment, on the existing floor. That's the cheapest way of doing it, but you still get to about 25, 30 for a whole apartment. Typically, there might be, the air conditioning may need either replacing or just a little bit of a service. And let's put it like this: in any issue, I would just say to anyone buying in Israel, the main issue we're concerned about is water damage. It can be from a neighbor above, it can be from one's own house, it can be from a roof. And a good inspector should be able to get to the bottom of it. I myself have a little bit of inkling sometimes, but I'm not a professional in that field. But most problems are solvable. It's just a question of how much and who's going to pay for it. So that's just a factor to take into account when buying. So those are pretty much the costs of an apartment. Now, we have two more topics. Why buy in Eretz Yisrael at all? So obviously, the fact that everyone's here, either they're in Israel already, or they're thinking of moving here, or maybe it's for investment. The obvious, why do people want to move to Eretz Yisrael? Well, you can all tell me that better than I can. It's people see the milas of the advantages of living in Eretz Yisrael, the land that is more ruchni, more spiritually based. Times are uncertain, people prefer to be together. And what I've seen in Ramat Beit Shemesh over the last 20 years, it started off as essentially a sort of small town without a makolet. And essentially the area became very populated, and it was full of young couples. Now it's full of older couples as such, people marrying off their kids already, and as such. And the Aleph area, sort of, again, without looking at maps as such, but all the areas around Aleph have been built up in an amazing way. Every time people come and visit, they can't believe there's another neighborhood. It's gone up on this hilltop, that hilltop. I think it's worth just stating, because I did see a lot of Ramat Beit Shemesh interest on the sign-up sheet, that the area essentially is consisted around Aleph. There's what's called Mishkafayim. There's what's called Mem Shalosh, which is mostly cottages. You also have Gimel. They have Daled and Hey. Daled is essentially a continuation of Gimel. That means it's kind of going to be probably mostly Haredi. Hey is meant to be more open as such. And kind of interestingly, whenever you go around, whenever you talk to someone in Chutzlatz and they're thinking of Eretz Yisrael, so somehow Ramat Beit Shemesh is always a consideration. Why? Why would that be? The answer is because 20 years ago, or 15, whenever it was, there were some people who had vision and realized that, yes, not everyone's going to live in Yerushalayim, so they moved out here. They started setting up shuls, and for example, the Gra, which used to be like in an apartment, and now they've built this huge, 1,000 square meter, or however big it is, beautiful shul that's going to be open soon, all being well. We have Rabbi Haber, and people who set up communities. And therefore, when people come, basically Ramat Beit Shemesh is like a sort of a easy landing for people to come into Eretz Yisrael, whereby you can live, whether you want to live in the Dolev area, the Rubivim area, Lachish area, you'll find some kind of community that you'll probably fit in. The question is which one, because there's so many. But people who I talk to, that often they've barely even been to the area, and they've sort of got their sights. They just somehow know that this particular shul or whatever is for them, and therefore they base their decisions on that. So, therefore, there's been a massive growth in this area. Now, that's basically in terms of why one but to live. Yes, Ramat Beit Shemesh somehow is always up there. In terms of investment, what's the point of investing in Eretz Yisrael? Well, the answer is that the main gain is the capital gains. Essentially the site, it's less cyclical than in other places. What that means is that even if the market is stalled for a year or even for some years, as it's been since the 8% purchase tax, which Baruch Hashem has now being rethought out. Even when the market is slow, the prices are not really dropping. And on the contrary, a 4-room, a 3-bedroom in Bet Shemesh, when I started out, used to be 1.1, then it was 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and basically now we're in the 1.5 to 1.6 range, you see. So the main gain of investing in Eretz Yisrael, the capital gains, has a rather proven track record of going up. Why? Because there's a short supply. The land is not small. There's plenty of room for construction. However, the Israeli system releases land when they want to. And what that means is that essentially there's never enough apartments. That we have threefold. We have we have a mass demand, people wanting to live in Eretz Yisrael every year, at least in non-Corona years, and even in Corona years, there's dozens of families who choose Ramat Beit Shemesh, for example. So we have people moving here. We have investors who, if they're going to invest somewhere, they want it in Eretz Yisrael. One day they might retire here. And then within Eretz Yisrael, we have every year something like 30,000 weddings, and all these couples need somewhere to live and an apartment. So all that, coupled with the fact that, well, the government's been trying to make prices go down without any success, let's face it. They did implement a program which is basically coming to an end, so I'm not even going to bring it up. They're trying to find another way to help the young couples, but ultimately it does not seem a clear objective to lower prices because it doesn't work and they can't. So therefore it's a supply and demand, and that's why people come to Ramat Beit Shemesh and get surprised. Like, I can have a whole house in America in the middle of nowhere, and you're going to give me a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Well, yes, because the demand here is simply very, very strong. The other point of investing is that, let's say, imagine you're coming with a down payment of 600,000 shekels for an apartment that's, just say, costs 1.5. So my mortgage is 900,000 shekels. After 20 years, that mortgage has been paid off through, let's say, hopefully through the rent. So someone else has paid off the mortgage. That 1.5 has gone up in value after 20 years. What is it? 2.5, let's just say, with inflation and property prices. So your 600,000 in 20 years became 2.5, let's say. The typical rate of return on an investment is generally between 3 and 5%. Sometimes an apartment has what we call a rental unit. That's a second income on the property, like a closed something or other, which one rents out. There's a big demand. Airbnbs there's many Airbnbs around, and even in times of Corona, there's still people that need them. Or you put someone in long term and get a little bit of a lower return, but that's the idea. Another advantage is you're essentially holding on to a physical asset, where in times of uncertainty, physical assets generally hold their value, and if there's inflationary problems, they will still continue to do okay. Therefore, that's why the banks, their whole mission is lending money for apartments and not lending you money for the stock market, because they view them as safe investments, you see. Just the idea is that if anyone is thinking of investing, buying an apartment that's self-investing, I generally don't advise to buy to flip in the short term. In the long term, yes, but it's not a short-term thing. There are costs, like I've mentioned and are going to be mentioned. It used to be that with that 8% purchase tax plus the agents plus the lawyers, it was about 11% closing costs. It's now with the going down to 5%, so it'll be more like 8% on a foreign buyer, which is somewhat more bearable. So even if the prices are going up each year between 4 and 8%, let's just say, for example, the idea is just hold on to it as much as you can, because the capital gains have a track record. So that's a little bit about why buying in Eretz Yisrael. Question came in: who pays for the agents and the lawyers' fees, the buyer or the seller? Very interesting question. Simply put, in short, the seller has his own agent, the buyer has his own agent. Now, what it can happen, and Americans don't like this, that an agent can be representing both sides. I understand why people don't like it. It's an interesting discussion. I personally feel that if one has to make the deal, one has to keep both sides happy, and therefore that means one still has to work for both sides. Each side has to take their own lawyer and pay their own lawyer. Someone's just written, church-owned land, is this still an issue? The answer essentially is yes, because let's put it like this: church land is mainly an issue in Jerusalem, I think. It's a bit of I think the two sides are that on one hand, it's an unresolved issue, meaning that it's unlikely that the church are really going to reclaim the property. Let's face it, I would think. Don't quote me on this. On the other hand, those properties are cheaper because of the uncertainty. So some people just won't touch these properties, and some will say, well, I'll take the gamble if I'm saving 500,000 shekels. One way or the other, the Israeli government will have to make some kind of settlement sooner or later. We're very good at burying issues under the carpet, but it sort of surfaces every couple of years and then it goes quiet. So thank you, Richard. Are properties ever sold in auction? They are from time to time, not at the same frequency as America. Foreclosing is not. There is such a thing. It's called kones nechasim. It's like the Ramat Bet Shemesh area is essentially families. Sometimes there's divorces, and so yeah, things do end up with the lawyers and the auctions as such. One really has to be very much have your finger on the pulse to sort of get in on those properties, I would say. Meaning that in the same way, Pliny, is sitting in America thinking, I'm going to get the deal. There may be another 200 people who are kind of, waiting for that deal as such. Okay. So keep the questions coming. I hope maybe, I don't know if I'm being brief or I'm being over elaborating or not. It's very hard because sort of I'm talking to you guys. I can't kind of hear as such. You're all muted. Let's deal with the last topic. This is that I had anyway. This is a sort of very fundamental point: buying on paper versus buying the existing. Once upon a time, buying on paper was very attractive. Now my personal, again, these are my personal views. It can be somewhat less attractive, but I'm going to explain the advantages and disadvantages for each. Let's just go through what are the costs that you need to know about. When you buy on paper, you need obviously the purchase price. The purchase price, this is something one needs to know. The kablanim, the builders, try and link it to, they have this inflationary figure that comes out each month. So the claim is that the costs of building are going up. I know China, they can't get the marble from China or whatever exactly is going on in the world, I don't know anymore. But so therefore, the price of raw materials rises. So you fix the price. You think you're buying it for 2 million. No, but each month it's subject to this inflationary rate. That is only applicable on the balance that you have not paid. So whatever you have paid off is paid off, finished. Whatever you still need to pay is subject to this inflation link. Now, unless you can get a deal with a builder where it's finished, but nevertheless, some builders will negotiate on that. Some builders will not negotiate on that. So that is an extra cost, building linkage. One has to pay one's own lawyer. I'd strongly advise getting your own lawyer as well. You have to pay, I think, about 5,000 shekels for the kablan's lawyer for the work that he's going to do. For you as such. Then, what other costs one should expect? The kablan gives you his specifications: 8 meters of kitchen cabinets below, 4 meters above. That sounds like a lot, but it's not. They basically use this whole calculation. One usually ends up upgrading, putting in one's own kitchen. Basically, you take a credit from the builder, or you add on to what he's giving you. But one will usually, meaning if you're buying it to live in, you'll probably end up wanting to upgrade it. If you're buying it as an investment, you could perhaps get away with what the kablan's giving you. But when you come to resell it, then you're selling it with a kablan kitchen. Bathrooms, the Kabbalan gives you a standard bathroom with he gives you a choice of tiles. They're not, one can upgrade them, that's another upgrade. The Kabbalans charge for all these things, the upgrades in tiles, moving walls around, extra electricity points, or even moving electricity points, moving plumbing. Typically, the Kabbalanim are not giving air conditioning, they're giving preparation for air conditioning, and they're not giving security bars. So one has to work out the whole cost of it. Because the Kabbalanim have paid so much for the land, it's not so clear anymore that it's such a deal as such. So therefore, it depends on what one's motive is. And therefore, when people say, well, should I buy on paper, should I buy what's existing, it's very much a personal decision. Sometimes one buys on paper because the Kabbalanim will give you a deal. You can pay 20% on the contract and then 80% at the end. That appeals to some because of cash flow reasons and whatever. But that 80% still has to be found at the end. And one needs to know, is it only 80% or am I going to be paying more for the building index as such? So, whilst on the other hand, okay, so let's go through some of these advantages. So buying on paper, what's the case to buy on paper? Why would I buy on paper then? So number one, if you get in at the beginning of the project, you may well get a better price. Why? Because the Kabbalan is desperate for money to pay off for the land, to bring in the tractors, to bring in this and that. He needs your money and he will give you a discount. Supposedly the prices are cheaper when you buy on paper. The point I've sort of been trying to say is that by the time you get to the point where it's actually ready to move into, it can be quite comparable with other stuff. And that's why I say it's a personal decision. Let's keep going though. Why would one buy on paper? Number one, you can get a better price, hopefully. Number two, if you buy at the beginning, you get the best choice of apartments. I want that garden apartment that's 2.5 million on Oled might only cost me 2.1 in the new. So I get the best selection. I can choose the view. Some people like to design their apartments. In other words, especially if it's to live in, you're not happy with the 3x3 bedroom that they're giving. So somehow I can move the bedrooms, convert 2 bedrooms into 1, etc. 3x3, I meant meters, not feet. Okay. People prefer the newer. In other words, why would I take on an old building, an old problems, a dumpy building? I can get something new. Some people don't like the existing buildings in Aleph as such. Some of them don't have elevators. Some of them have weird layouts. Let's just call a spade a spade. Another reason why one might buy on paper is perhaps one's moving with a community or getting together, a bunch of friends to all buy, reasonably near each other, family, marrying off kids, whatever exactly it is. So therefore, that's something you can do on paper, much more easier than finding second-hand apartments. I should mention as well that once upon a time, buying on paper was fraught with risk. The builders went bust. And people lost their money, unfortunately. The situation's been rectified somewhat in that now the builders give bank guarantees. That means that every shekel you give to the builder is actually given into his bank account, which is only released subject to completing certain stages of production. And so therefore the money is more secure. Now that's not to say the builder can't go bust still, but the money is therefore guaranteed, and either someone else will step in the project or possibly one gets his money back. But either way, it's more secure than it used to be. What's the case against buying on paper? There is a case to say that buildings that have been existing for 20 years may have been built with better materials than the more recent standard. Like I said, the Kabbalan, now I may get in trouble for this, but I think it's an Atzias that sort of my engineer has sort of confirmed that sometimes, I'm not saying always, but sometimes the quality of construction can be a little substandard. Now, does that mean one shouldn't buy it? Not necessarily. One just has to know that what is the exact issues? Are there issues? And ultimately, even if the question is, how does this if it's built somewhat cheaper, is it likely to actually impact my life as such? There's no such thing as perfect. The inspection reports I see are usually 5, 6, 7, 8 pages long, and a lot of points, which many of which are, I would say, are fairly trivial. But nevertheless, the engineer has to put it down. That's his job, to quantify exactly. So if there's a tile not in place, he'll put it, or the kitchen cabinets are wonky, whatever exactly it is. So quality of construction, sometimes in Aleph, things have been dealt with and are now sort of better as such. The new construction, there were cases of new construction where there was, rutivut, what we call molds, that even before they moved in as such. In this area I was talking about before, Mem Shalosh, which is all cottages, there's about 4 or 5 different types of builders, and it rates from very good to very poor, and everything in between. If you want to know which is which, feel free to contact me another time. Delays. There's a question here, how realistic are the time frames for buying on paper? If they say 3, is it likely or will it likely be longer? That's the $1 million question. I think the answer is there's only a few kablanim with a proven track record, and even the kablanim with a proven track record are often subject to issues that are not necessarily within their control, such as Iriyat Beit Shemesh. I don't hope there's no one from Iriyat Beit Shemesh watching me tonight, but there can be delays in the paperwork as such. It is a gamble. If a builder tells you, 2 years, don't start packing, just before the 2 years is up, you may be in for a wait. It doesn't mean 10 years, but there used to be what's called buyers groups, which typically what that meant was that people got together to buy. They hired the kablan themselves, and they kind of saved money because they were the, what you might call the business people as such. They've gone out of fashion because they got so held up because of problems within the group and etc. that they're not really doing them much anymore. Okay, so delays, yeah, absolutely. Again, it's not necessarily the fault of the kablan, but it can just be a metzias, a fact of life kind of thing. Another factor to mention about buying on paper is that, for example, I just saw today the first project in Daled got their Tofes Arba. That's the final stage of the process. That means the inhabitants can move in. I'm very pleased for them. The issue is that there's no infrastructure in a new area. Even in Mishkafayim, they've just about got buses. There's no makoleh. If they need a bag of milk, they got to come into Aleph. There's not a proper shul there as such, and the area's been around for 2-3 years or more, inhabited as such. Things do take time until they get off the ground. Another issue is that when one takes possession, if one is an investor, the rents initially are going to be quite low because there's a flood of these things on the market, like yourselves. There's other investors, they all need to rent them out. And, who wants to live in the area with no buses and no infrastructure as such? So it's kind of like, it does take time before these things catch up and become as popular, like Aleph, let's say. It can also be hard to flip something. Let's say, for example, one enters the project and then one wants to get out of it. I just see a lot of stuff, so much stuff for sale, that it could be that if one needed to leave early, one could even end up having to take a loss on it because there's just so much available as such. Another thing is you don't necessarily know who's actually buying there as such, who the neighbors really are. The agent, the kablan, either they won't tell you, or they'll, give you some information. And what happened was, like, there was an area, Gimel Shtaim, not over the hill kind of, and there's a mix. One project, the Wolfson project, became, very successful. There were other projects which basically went to Hasidim, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Hasidim. I'm just saying that some people it's very polarized here, and one wants to gravitate to where one feels comfortable. So that's what I'm saying. There are various degrees of uncertainty, and therefore when people ask me, well, should we buy on paper, should we buy on something that's existing, it's a very personal choice. And I think it also depends on what stage of life one's up to. You know, life is, 120 years. If it's going to take 5 years and one's already, 65, you have to be a bit of a pioneer to enter a place like, like Dalet as such, where we really don't know it's going to be an extension of Gimel, probably. The case for existing properties is as follows. You know what you're getting. You walk around it. You know what it is. You can assess the expenses very accurately. There's no hidden surprises because your engineers quantified for you. You bring in a kablan. How much will it cost to change this kitchen, to move, to fix the air conditioning or whatever needs fixing as such? Like I said, it may be, I'm not saying this is an absolute, but it may be that the old may have been built better perhaps. And as I said, we have existing communities, and one doesn't have to wait, a number of years. Gimel is started being inhabited 5-6 years ago, and slowly there's shuls, yeshivas there. There's something going on there. The rents are picking up, but like I said, if one's doing it for investment, there is a lag till one will see the right return. So that's the case for existing properties. The case against existing properties, well, they're old. One has to renovate. Sometimes the buildings often seem run down. Typically in Aleph, it breaks my heart to say this, but many of the buildings in Aleph are not very well maintained. It's often a reason not because anyone has bad intentions or is deliberately trying to mess up the place. It's just a reality that people have different priorities, and large families, and the stairwells are often dirty and that sort of thing. We do live together, Klal Yisrael, and that it's just how it is. So, okay. So those are basic, I think, a fairly brief overview. That's mostly what I had to say. Let's see if there are some questions here. I think I had already signed a contract till it's binding, shall send off the inspector's report and make have the option to have a sales agreement with the option. No, there's no option to back out, really, unless you put in a vase. No, the engineer's report will be done before signing. That's a fact. Do I deal in rentals, long-term rentals for seniors? What I'll say is, I'll perhaps post my contact details. It's got late, Baruch Hashem. I hope I haven't been speaking for too long. Aaron's got a great presentation now. I'm Jonathan Shooter. My website is www.jsrealtyisrael.com. You can email me, jonathanshooter613. I'll put all these up in the chat, at gmail.com. WhatsApp 0544513847 if you want. No, not the jsrealtyisrael.com. And thank you very much. And back to the presenter.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was very informative, and thanks for answering all the questions as they were coming up. We're now going to introduce you to Aaron Morgan. Aaron is the owner of Morgan Mortgage. He's been working as a mortgage broker in Israel for about 15 years and has a background as an actuary and a foreign exchange specialist. So Aaron has a strong financial background, and he also combines that with his personable customer service. So in Israel, in the Anglo market, Aaron's company is very well known. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Aaron Morgan. We will unmute him. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah, can you give me a thumbs up if you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, great. Okay, so welcome, and Yehudis, thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is I'm going to go through some of the highlights of getting a mortgage in Israel, getting financing for a property in Israel. And in particular, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to highlight some of the differences that you see in the mortgage market here in Israel, as opposed to what you might be expecting based on where you come from. Okay, and what you find in Israel, just to summarize, is that the options here are much more sophisticated. So on the one hand, the process is more complicated. The options are more complicated. However, at the same time, because you have this level of sophistication, if you can learn a little bit about the market and what's available, so you can really tailor your economic situation to really, or you can tailor your mortgage rather to your economic situation in a very, very specific way. And you really have a chance to take advantage of a mortgage market, which has really a lot to offer. Okay. So first of all, just some unique aspects of the Israeli mortgage market. Number one, as I just basically stated, you have many more options, okay, when you get a mortgage. It's very common in Israel that you actually segment your mortgage into different parts. You get part fixed, part variable, and surprisingly, you can also get mortgages in different currencies. So for example, if you have income from the US, for example, so you can actually get a mortgage that's in US dollars. And the advantage of that is that you can essentially eliminate your currency risk vis-a-vis your income. So in other words, if you're earning US dollars and then your mortgage payment is also in dollars, you don't have to be worrying about the US dollar weakening in value against the shekel. And so you have a, it's a big advantage with that. Now, the next thing we're going to speak about is the process. Okay, so Jonathan alluded to this when he was speaking, but just to summarize, when you sign a contract in Israel, it's really considered final. Okay, even if you haven't made all your payments. So as Jonathan made reference to, when you buy property, so you generally speaking put down at least 10%, sometimes 15% of the price of the property. Now, it's important when you sign a contract that you do all your homework first. And what does that mean? As opposed to the US, when you sign a contract here, it's final. So in other words, you don't sign a contract here that's, for example, conditional upon financing. Okay, you can't sign a contract here. It's very, very uncommon that you can sign a contract here in Israel, then go try to find a mortgage. And theoretically, if you didn't get approved for the mortgage, you can't back out of the contract. Okay, so it's very, very important to get pre-approved for a mortgage before you sign a contract. Okay, so just as an example, let's say you're interested in a property that's 2 million shekels and you're interested in borrowing 1 million shekels. So the first step is to get approved for the mortgage, and that's based, generally speaking, on your income. And then you get a piece of paper from the bank that shows that you're approved for that mortgage. Okay, but what does that mean? It means that you're really approved for, in this case, again, it's a 1 million shekel mortgage and a 2 million shekel property. So what that means really is that you're approved for 50%. Okay, which brings us to the second part of the approval. What you're approved for is 50% of the appraised value of the property. Okay, so in other words, the banks send an appraiser to see your property. And theoretically, if the bank's appraiser comes back and says that your property is only worth, for example, 1.8 million shekels, so that means that you're really only going to be approved for a 900,000 shekel mortgage. Okay, and so in other words, there are really two parts to getting approved for a mortgage. Number one is your approval based on financing. Okay, making sure that the bank sees that you have sufficient income to get approved for the mortgage. And then secondly, making sure that the bank will give you the full value, will give you that that full 50%, for example, given the value of your property. So it also means maybe ordering an appraisal before you sign a contract. And when you're going through this process, you have to really take responsibility for doing both of these things, because you can go ahead and you can sign a contract without anyone telling you to do otherwise, and then you can be surprised afterwards to find out, chas v'shalom, can't get approved for the mortgage, or the bank appraiser will value the property for less than the purchase price, and then you can really run into difficulties. Okay, and that also goes for sending an inspector. Okay, like this is unrelated to a mortgage, but for example, if you want to send an engineer to see the property, so the different perspectives, but if there's a concern that the property has problems, so you really have to do your homework beforehand and send the engineer to the property beforehand and have him look at it and make sure that the property is okay, because once you sign the contract, you really can't back out of it. Okay, so that's a very, very key point when you're getting a mortgage and you're buying a property here in Israel. Okay, Next question, how much can you borrow? Okay, so it basically works like this. Number one, depends on whether you have a Teudat Zut, whether you have Israeli citizenship. Okay, so if you have Israeli citizenship and your spouse also has Israeli citizenship, so you can borrow a maximum of 75% of the price of the property. Okay, that's if it's your first property in Israel. Okay, now I mentioned it's based on citizenship. So theoretically, if there's somebody who lives overseas, someone who lives in America, and they have a parent who is Israeli, and therefore they automatically also have Israeli citizenship, even though they live in the US, they can still theoretically get that 75%. Okay, the 75% is based on citizenship, not based on residency. Okay, now if you haven't made Aliyah, you don't have Israeli citizenship, so then you're limited to 50% financing. Okay, so if you're getting a 2 million shekel property again, and you're not Israeli, so then you're limited to, for example, then in this case, you're limited to a 1 million shekel mortgage. Okay, okay, great. Okay, so now we have sorted out how much of a down payment you need. Now, when you figure out how much you need to close on a transaction, so there are really two things you have to budget for. Number one, you have to budget for the down payment, which is what we just talked about. And then secondly, you have to also budget for all the closing costs. Okay, so in other words, Jonathan went through most of those closing costs for you already, right? We said the real estate agent, the purchase taxes, the lawyer rather. Okay, and then also there are fees for if you're taking a mortgage broker, the mortgage bank has a fee as well. So all these extra fees associated with the transaction have to also be paid for out of pocket. Okay, so in other words, in the situation that we talked about, so if you're buying this 2 million shekel property and you have, for example, a 1 million shekel down payment, so then you have to add on, maybe another 8% that you have to come up with out of pocket in order to close on the transaction. All right. Now, in terms of actually getting approved for the mortgage, the way it works in Israel is that the banks primarily look at your income. Okay, and if there's somebody if you're living in Israel, so they'll look at your telushim, right, like your salary slips. If you're independent, they'll look for your tax returns. If you're living overseas or you're earning money from overseas, then the banks primarily look at your tax returns. Okay, in other words, if you're in the US, they'll ask for your 1040s. If you're in England, they'll ask for your SA100s or P60s. Canada, your T1s. Okay, the banks accept foreign income, and they don't discriminate in any way when regardless of where you are earning your money. Okay, they also look at, generally speaking, they'll also look at your credit report. If you're earning money from overseas, they'll ask for your credit report from overseas. And if you live here in Israel, so then they'll do a credit check for you here as well. Okay, but primarily, really, the banks are looking at your income when they're deciding whether they're going to approve you for a mortgage. And basically, the way it works is that the bank looks at whatever your monthly mortgage payment is, and they want to see that you're earning at least 2.5 times that amount each month. Okay, so again, whatever your monthly mortgage payment is, the bank wants to see that you're earning at least 2.5 times that amount after taxes. Okay, so just to give you an example, let's say, for example, you're taking out a 1 million shekel mortgage, and let's say you're taking out a 30-year, 1 million shekel mortgage, and you're getting, for example, a 30-year mortgage, okay, or 25-year mortgage. So your monthly payment is going to be roughly around 5,000 shekels a month. So the bank wants to see that you're earning 2.5 times that amount each month. Okay, so in other words, the bank wants to see that you're earning how much? You're all muted, so you can't answer. Okay, so yeah, the bank wants to see that you're earning 12,500 shekels of income per month. Okay, and that's net of taxes. Okay, after taxes. Also, if, for example, you're in the US and you're paying a mortgage in the US, or if you're in Israel and you have another property, so the bank takes your net income and they subtract off how much you're paying in mortgage costs already, monthly mortgage costs, and that's the amount that has to be 2.5 times your monthly mortgage payments. So in other words, if, for example, you are earning 18,000 shekels a month, and then you are making mortgage payments already of, let's say, 3,000 shekels a month. So from the bank's perspective, you're really earning 15,000 shekels a month. And that's the amount that has to be 2.5 times the amount of your monthly mortgage payment. Okay? Okay, great. Okay, so I mentioned in the last example that, an example of a 30-year mortgage. So how long of a mortgage can you actually get here in Israel? So generally speaking, what the banks will tell you is that the mortgage has to be paid off by age 75. Okay, so what that means is, for example, someone who is 50 years old, so that person can theoretically get a 25-year mortgage. Okay, and a 60-year-old, for example, can get a 15-year mortgage. Okay, but it's Israel, so there are always exceptions. Okay, so the banks will tell you that you can get a mortgage till age 75, but really everything's negotiable. Okay, so basically what that means is that you can really, practically speaking, get a mortgage till age 80. Okay, or maybe even till age 83. Okay, so it depends on the strength of the application, how much the mortgage broker nudges the bank. Okay, but it's possible theoretically to get a mortgage up until age 80. Okay, so again, like a 60-year-old, for example, could get, potentially a 20-year mortgage. Okay, and the other thing that you can do if someone's older is they can actually get a child to sign on the mortgage with them. So in a situation like that, if you had, for example, like a 60-year-old borrower, and the bank wouldn't otherwise give them a 30-year mortgage, but if they have a child who's earning money, so then in a situation like that, that 60-year-old could actually get a 30-year mortgage. Okay. Okay. I also mentioned at the beginning that a lot of different options, and one of the options is that you can get a mortgage in various currencies. Okay, I mentioned you can get a shekel mortgage, you can get a US dollar mortgage, and actually theoretically you can really get a mortgage in almost any currency here in Israel. Okay, and again, the idea with that is that you're matching up the currency of your income to the currency of your mortgage. Okay, so again, if you're earning US dollars and you're planning to make payments and you're planning to make the payments for the mortgage, in other words, you're not getting, for example, a renter. So the idea is that if you take your US dollar income and use it to pay your US dollar mortgage, then the idea there is that you essentially eliminate your currency risk and you don't have to worry about the dollar going up and down vis-a-vis the shekel. Okay, so that's a nice advantage. Okay, the next thing I have is, and also please feel free to send in questions. I see we have a couple questions already. Okay, one of them looks like we answered. Okay, here's a very good question. Is there an Oled discount? So the answer is yes and no. Okay, so it works like this. If you make Aliyah, so then there is an Oled discount. And the way it works is that, again, if you're taking a 1 million shekel mortgage, then what the Israeli government does is they give you a quote-unquote discounted mortgage, but it only applies to around usually the first 100 or 150,000 shekels of your mortgage. In other words, you're getting 150,000 shekels from the government, and then the last 850,000 is from the bank. Now, the thing is that the way the interest rates are today, they're really at record all-time historical lows. So surprisingly, if you get a great interest rate on your mortgage, or even like a good interest rate on your mortgage, you should actually find that surprisingly, the rates that you're getting from the bank are actually cheaper than the Oled mortgage. Okay, so it's very common that people will actually decline, especially if you're using a broker, you should be getting very good interest rates. So in a situation like that, you should really find that the bank's rates are better than the Oled mortgage, and really you would end up declining the rights. There's a bit of a misunderstanding because the way the bank's or the government's Oled mortgage, it has a hidden cost in it. Okay, it's nothing. I don't think they're trying to be sneaky, but there is a hidden cost. Okay, so the government mortgage, it is tied to the Israeli inflation index. So in other words, they'll quote you an interest rate, let's say of around 3%, which sounds very cheap, and they'll call it a fixed rate mortgage. However, it's also tied to the Israeli inflation index. Okay, and the Bank of Israel targets inflation to be between 1% to 3%. The bottom line is that on this government subsidized mortgage, you're really paying around 5%. Okay, as opposed to, the interest rates in general in Israel, which are generally speaking, under 4%. Okay, so practically, the Oled mortgage is not generally speaking very relevant. Okay, here's a very good question. Can expected rental income from the property which is being purchased be taken into account when calculating the 2.5 times coverage of the mortgage amount, of the mortgage payment, right? So the bank, again, they're focusing on your income when they're deciding whether they're approving you for a mortgage or not. So the question is, can rental income count towards that calculation? So the answer is as follows. If this is your first property, then the answer is no. The bank will not consider your rental income. But if it's, you have more than one property, so then the bank, yes, they will count that income. Okay, and if, for example, you own a property in the US, and this is your first property in Israel, it's still counted as your second property, and the bank, yes, will consider the rental income as part of your income. Okay, there's one major exception to that. It's very common in Israel, if you're not familiar with this already, that people build units which are not legal. Okay, on the one hand, they're not legal. On the other hand, everyone does it, and no one seems to be overly bothered by it. Okay, but the one group of people who are slightly bothered by it are the mortgage banks. Okay, so if you have a rental unit, like an illegal rental unit, which again is very common in Israel, so then you can rent it out, and there's a very good chance that no one's going to give you a hard time about it. However, in terms of using that money as rental income, so the mortgage banks will not accept it. Okay, if the mortgage bank sees that there's a unit which is not legal, they might be really fine with it. However, they won't count that rental income towards that calculation that we described previously. Okay. Okay, here's another good question. Can one get a mortgage from a Chutz La'aretz bank? Okay, so if you're talking about a US bank, so a US bank, my experience is, will not put a lien on an Israeli property. Okay, in other words, it's a very complicated process here, and there are a lot of regulations. So to the best of my knowledge, it is not possible to use a US bank to give a mortgage on a property here in Israel. Okay, what you can do though, for example, is if you have an existing property in the US, so you can borrow money on that property, from a US bank, right? So if you have a property, you're in New York and you have a property that you live in, so you can go to your bank in the US and ask them to take out a home equity line of credit and take that cash and then transfer it to Israel, and then, so to speak, pay cash for the property. Okay, that's quite common. So in that case, it's the process can sometimes be much more simple. If it's a simple process getting a mortgage for you where you live, and then again you transfer the money over to Israel, and then you can pay cash for the property, or you can pay part of it from that home equity line of credit and take the rest of the money theoretically from an Israeli mortgage bank. Okay. Okay, you can feel free to continue sending questions, and in the meantime, I'll move on to the next topic. Okay, the next topic I have here is costs associated with taking out a mortgage. Jonathan mentioned the other costs associated with buying a property, right? He mentioned, just to review, purchase taxes, real estate lawyer, and real estate agent. Those are the main three costs associated that are not, don't have to do with the mortgage. In terms of mortgage costs, okay, so basically it works like this. When you take out a mortgage from an Israeli bank, they charge you a fee for doing the mortgage with them. It's a one-time fee that they charge you. It's called Petichat Tik, opening up the file. And generally speaking, that fee is equal to 0.25% of the mortgage amount. Okay, so that's one of those fees that you have to budget for, okay, and have extra cash for that. Okay, so for example, if you're taking out a 1 million shekel mortgage, so 0.25% fee means that you have a fee of 2,500 shekels. Okay. It's possible. It's Israel, so everything's negotiable. So it can be that you'll get a discount off that fee. Okay. If you use a mortgage broker, you should get a discount off that fee. If you nudge the bank yourself, you'll get a discount off the fee. Okay, just the way it works. Okay, so that's that. Okay, next is mortgage broker. So you have two different ways you can do your mortgage. You can take care of your mortgage. You can either do the mortgage yourself. That means going to the mortgage banks yourself, nudging the banks yourself, putting the application and taking care of the whole process yourself. Or you can use a mortgage broker, okay, someone like myself. If you do the mortgage yourself, so the advantage to that is that you don't pay a mortgage broker, okay? So mortgage brokers, generally speaking, charge between 1% and 1.25% of the mortgage amount, okay? And that depends, generally speaking, if you are here in Israel or if you are living abroad, Okay, it's a little bit more expensive if you're living abroad because there are power of attorney documents that are needed, and the process in general is a little bit more complicated for the mortgage broker. Okay, so so the advantage if you do the mortgage yourself, so you save the 1%. The trade-off is that, generally speaking, the mortgage brokers get the wholesale interest rates offered by the banks. So the idea is that, in theory, it should be that the mortgage broker should, save you money over time, even given the fact that he has a fee. Okay, and the way it works in Israel is that mortgages are, it's not legal for a bank to pay a mortgage broker. So essentially, the way it works is that the mortgage brokers have deals worked out with the banks where the mortgage brokers' clients get discounted interest rates, and then the mortgage brokers charge their clients directly. Okay. Okay, so we're talking about costs. We have the 0.25% fee from the mortgage bank. Okay, and all these numbers are a little bit conservative because they said it can be negotiable. Then you have the 1 to 1.25% fee charged if you're using a mortgage broker. So, for example, on a 1 million shekel mortgage, if the fee is 1%, it's 10,000 shekels, and then and then on top of that, there's the 17% VAT or MAM. Okay, that's the service tax. So the 10,000 shekels is really like 11,700. Okay, so that's the way that works. If you're buying property that's secondhand, so then you have the bank's appraisal, and it ranges. The appraisals range in price, and it's generally speaking anywhere from about 1,000 shekels to about 3,000 shekels. Okay, it depends on the type of transaction, depends on the timing of when you do the appraisal, but generally speaking, you should be budgeting for, let's say, up to 3,000 shekels for an appraisal. Okay, now the other thing, right, and then you also have a number of other minor fees. Okay, you have to have your mortgage registered in the land registry. There's a power of attorney document which has to be notarized. If you have a mortgage broker, they take care of all these things for you, but the offices where these different things are processed, they have their fees. So all these extra fees, you should budget for about another 800 or 1,000 shekels. Okay, it's not a huge amount, but it's just something else to budget for. And then the last thing I'm going to mention in terms of extra fees is not a one-time fee like these other fees that I just mentioned, but it's standard in Israel that you have to get life insurance for your mortgage, in the amount of your mortgage. Okay, in other words, each spouse has to get insurance for the amount of the mortgage. So if you're getting a 1 million shekel mortgage, both the husband and the wife have to get 1 million shekel life insurance policies. And the way it works is that they're, generally speaking, not terribly expensive. And the reason why is because they have policies in Israel where the insurance, the amount of the benefit is equal to the outstanding amount of the mortgage. Okay, in other words, as you pay down your mortgage, your life insurance coverage also goes down. Okay, and because it's going down, so it means that the cost of the life insurance is less. Okay, there's a possibility if you have a policy in the US that you can actually use that policy. I won't get into the details of it, but it is possible to use that. Sometimes people find that policies in the US are cheaper, so you can use that. Even you can order a new policy from the US and you can theoretically use that. Okay, so that's something else. There's also something that's a little bit ironic, but insurance can be very expensive for someone who's a little bit older. So paradoxically, it's actually possible to get an exemption on the bank's requirement for insurance if you're older. Okay, in other words, the Bank of Israel wants people to have life insurance. So because they want it to be that chas v'shalom, one of the spouses is nifter, so they want it to be that the surviving spouse does not have the burden of the mortgage payment. So they require it on the one hand. However, they don't want it to be that that a high mortgage premium, or a high life insurance premium will actually stop you from actually buying a property. So given that, it's actually possible to actually get an exemption if you're older than a certain age. Okay, different banks have different limits. If you're 55, 60, 65, so it can be possible to get a partial or full exemption on the life insurance requirement. Okay, so those are basically the costs that are associated with buying, with getting a mortgage. Okay, we have a question here. Okay, so I see we have a question here from somebody wrote, what about Canadian? Okay, were you asking, I assume that you're asking, is it possible to get a Canadian dollar mortgage? I'm also Canadian. I'm from Ottawa and Toronto. Go Canada, eh? Okay. All right. Okay, great. So is that your question? Is it possible to get a Canadian dollar mortgage? Okay, great. So the answer is yes and no. Okay, the answer is yes because there are Canadian dollar mortgages, but the issue is that Canadian dollar mortgages in Israel tend to be a little bit, there's really only one bank which offers Canadian dollar mortgages, and that mortgage bank is in general pretty expensive. Okay, so you're not going to get great interest rates, and you can't get a 30-year mortgage. You know, if you're fine with like a 20-year mortgage, so it's doable, but the interest rates are a little bit more expensive. Okay, now I'll just tell you something else. I'm talking to all the foreigners right now. It's true you can get a US dollar mortgage, and it's good if you're earning US dollars, but what happens often is that, number one, if you're buying the property and you're going to be renting it out, so it's most likely that your tenant is going to be paying you in shekels. Okay, and if your tenant is paying you in shekels, so then it's very convenient to have a mortgage which is also based in shekels. Okay, in other words, you're collecting 4,000 shekels of rent a month, and your mortgage payment, please God, is less than that, is 3,500 shekels. So there's no need to, you know, so you're dealing in the same currency by taking a shekel mortgage. The other thing too is like this: if you're living overseas, okay, let's say you're buying a property and you are renting it out, or even not. But what happens is like this: if you're earning, let's say in your case, Canadian dollars, okay, so what happens is you're investing in Israel. Okay, so you're now holding an asset in a foreign currency. And what that means is that if while you are owning this foreign asset, you're owning this Israeli property, if it should happen that the currency should move the wrong way, so what it means is that your asset in this foreign currency could actually, you know, it could be that you lose money just on the foreign exchange risk. Okay, in other words, if the Canadian dollar moves the wrong way, it could be that when you convert your money back over into Canadian dollars, if that's going to be one day, so it could be that you'll actually lose money on your investment simply because the currency went the wrong way. Okay, so one way to minimize that currency risk is by taking a mortgage also in shekels. In other words, if you buy a property for 3 million shekels, so then you're exposed to the shekel, you know, by 3 million shekels. And as much as the shekel goes up and down against your currency, your US dollars, your Canadian dollars, so you're exposed to that currency. However, if you take a debt, in other words, if you take a mortgage of, let's say, 1 million shekels, so you're only exposed to the shekel by 2 million shekels, if you're following. Okay? In other words, you have an asset of 3 million shekels, so you're exposed to the shekel in a very big way. But if you're taking a mortgage, a debt in shekels, so that limits your exposure to the shekel exchange rate by 1 million shekels. So then you're only exposed to the shekel exchange rate by 2 million shekels. Okay, if you would like, after, you know, our meeting, I can go into more details, you know, if it's relevant, we can talk over your specific situation. But that's, generally speaking, the way to look at it. Just 1 minute. Okay, next question, Jonathan. If you can, if Jonathan can either be unmuted or if you want to type an answer. There's a question here: if you buy a property for 2 million shekels, more or less, what rent would you be likely to get? Jonathan, can you type an answer? That would be.
Are we talking about Ramat Beit Shemesh or Jerusalem?
I don't have an answer yet. Do you want to give an answer?
Let's say Ramat Beit Shemesh. Typically, a 2 million property could be renting anything between 5,500 to 6,000, just as a guess, without knowing the property.
Okay, great.
Okay, but that's a rough idea. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, okay. The next question is exactly what I was going to move on to next, which is the different mortgage options. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning, you can segment your mortgage into different parts. Okay, so again, it's can sound a little bit confusing, but if you spend a few minutes just understanding it, so it's really great because you can really tailor your economic goals, your financial goals to the type of mortgage that you're going to take. So basically like this, if you are, there are really two categories, okay? If you're taking a shekel mortgage, it works like this. The Bank of Israel, they limit you to how much of your mortgage can be variable, okay? So you get a variable rate mortgage in Israel, and generally speaking, the rate is somewhere around 1.6%. It's very, very cheap, okay? 1.6% for a variable rate mortgage. The rate has been like this, roughly, for around the last 3 years. And if you look at the last 15 years, the rates have consistently been under 4%. They've been just really, really low historically. So people, generally speaking, want to take that mortgage. But the Bank of Israel, they're concerned that people are going to take that type of mortgage, and then the interest rates one day will go back up, they'll go higher, and then people won't be able to afford their mortgages. So what the Bank of Israel does is they limit you, and they only allow that 1/3 of your mortgage should be tied to this variable rate. Okay? So you get this 1.6% mortgage, for example, but only 1/3 of your mortgage can be tied to that index. Okay? Now, the next third of your mortgage must be a fixed rate mortgage, right? For the same rationale, the Bank of Israel wants to make sure that part of your mortgage is fixed because they want it to be that you have a certain amount of security once the interest rates go up, okay? So the fixed rates, it really depends on how long you're taking your mortgage for. But just to give you a rough idea where interest rates are here in Israel, I'm going to quote you a little bit conservatively, okay? So hopefully you'll do a little better or much better than what I'm telling you, but just in terms of budgeting and to give you an idea, so if you're taking, for example, like a 30-year mortgage, so the interest rate on that might be somewhere around, let's say, 4.3%. And the way it works is that if you take a shorter mortgage period, so then the fixed rates actually come down. The interest rates are cheaper. Okay, so for example, if you take a 20-year mortgage, so then you're looking at a rate of around 4.1% or 4%. Okay, it's also theoretically possible to get, fixed rates for around 3.5% for 30 years. It really depends on your situation, okay? So I mentioned the first third of your mortgage can be variable. The next third of your mortgage must be fixed. And the last third of your mortgage can either be also a totally fixed rate mortgage. So you're getting a 2/3, so that 2/3 of your mortgage is fixed and 1/3 is variable, or that last third of your mortgage can be something which is tied to a 5-year index. Okay, in other words, you're getting still, let's say, for example, a 30-year mortgage, but the interest rate is being, it's being updated every 5 years according to the 5-year Bank of Israel index. Okay, if it's relevant, like we can speak, let's say after this, if you want to make an appointment, with pleasure, be happy to go over, different options and and speak what would be best for each of you. But just generally speaking, that's the way mortgages work. People ask about prepayment penalties. So, and just one other point in terms of the fixed and the variable. So there are many different options. Like you can, for example, do your variable rate for 30 years, your fixed rate for 10 years. There are all sorts of different combinations, okay? So that's maybe a little bit more in depth, but that's something to take into account. Also, people ask about prepayment penalties. So the way it works on prepayment penalties, generally speaking, with the way interest rates are today, it's very likely that if you take a mortgage, there'll be no prepayment penalties, okay? So the way it works is that on a variable rate mortgage, there's never a prepayment penalty. Okay, so that 1.6% shekel variable rate mortgage can be prepaid at any point in time, and there's not a prepayment penalty. On a fixed rate mortgage, the way it works is that the bank compares the interest rates that you took out your mortgage at. So let's say you take out a mortgage at a 4% interest rate. And if the interest rate is the same at the time that you prepay or higher, so then there's no penalty. So in other words, if in 5 years you want to prepay your mortgage or that part of the mortgage and the interest rate's gone up, or it's the same, let's say it's 4.5%, so then there's also no prepayment penalty. Okay, there's only a penalty if the interest rates have dropped from when you first took out your mortgage. And given that the interest rates right now are at historical lows, it's seemingly more likely that there'll be no penalty. Okay. Okay, very good. Okay, very good. Okay, I'm just to finish things off, I'm just gonna touch on one other point, which is foreign exchange risk. Okay, this is not about mortgages, but the other aspect of the other money aspect of financing, of paying for a property in Israel. So we talked about the mortgage aspect. The other part is your down payment money. Okay, so it's obviously very common that people are transferring funds over from, the country that you come from. Okay, and just to tell you how that's done, so you have a few different options. Okay, so in other words, we're talking about, let's say you're buying a property for 1.5 million shekels, and let's say you're getting a mortgage for 1 million shekels. Okay, and your down payment is 500,000 shekels. Okay, and let's say you have the money sitting in your bank account in the US or Canada or wherever, and you have to transfer it to Israel. So you have a few different options for transferring the money over. One option is to transfer it over, you have really two issues. One is converting your funds, and the other issue is transferring them over to Israel. So one option is you can convert the funds with your bank in the US or Canada. Now, my experience is, I'm just telling you my experience. You can check it out yourself. You should check it out yourself. But my experience is that if you want to convert your funds from US dollars to shekels, and you're going to your bank in the US, my experience is, based on what my clients tell me, is that it's much more expensive, and the banks there charge much more than what the banks here in Israel charge. Okay, the margins on conversions are really, really, really cheap in Israel. Okay, so that's good news if you want to convert your funds here in Israel. So the way it works is that you can either convert your funds via an Israeli bank, or you can convert your funds with a foreign exchange company. Okay, so if you do it so first of all, when you take out a mortgage, so you also open up a bank account here in Israel if you don't have one already, and that's something which can also be done from overseas. Okay, that's done as part of the mortgage process. So you can convert your funds through your Israeli bank account, through your Israeli bank. The disadvantage to doing that is twofold. Number one, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the conversion costs are more expensive than the third alternative, which I'm going to give you in a second. And number two, the service is usually not as good as this third option, which I'm going to give you in just a second. Okay, so what's this third option? So the third option is to use a foreign exchange company. Okay, there are a few companies in Israel that do this, and there's one company in particular, Forex Israel, so I can give you details of them. They've been around for many years, and they're generally speaking very trusted. So you can use them. There's another company called Israel Transfer. So again, just to summarize, the advantages of these companies are, number one, their conversion costs are much cheaper than the Israeli banks, and much, much cheaper than generally what you'd find, I think, in the company in the US or Canada. And then number two, the service is generally speaking, at least from these two companies, their service is generally speaking really excellent. Okay, they have English speakers manning the phones, and they're accustomed to North American style customer service, which is a good thing. Okay, and they really take care of not only converting your funds, but they'll make all your payments for you. So what does that mean? It means that you transfer your money over to this foreign exchange company, and then they'll convert it into shekels, and then they'll take the bulk of the money and they'll pay your seller, or they'll pay the builder, and then they'll also make your other payments. In other words, they'll pay your purchase taxes for you, which in Israel is not such a straightforward thing always, but they'll take care of it for you. They'll pay your real estate agent, your real estate lawyer, your mortgage broker. They'll make all your payments for you. And you can give them instructions by email, by phone. They're very easy to deal with, and generally speaking, they're very popular. Okay. The one disadvantage to using them is that they're not as safe as the safest option really is to do it all through an Israeli bank, because it's an Israeli bank. Okay. These foreign exchange companies are not insured, so there's a theoretical element of risk. Okay. So what can you do? So you have to decide if you're comfortable with that level of risk. You can get recommendations and make your decision accordingly. But so that's the one advantage to using a regular Israeli bank, whereas the foreign exchange companies, the advantage of them is that the service is generally speaking really excellent, and also the conversion costs are generally speaking a little bit better. Okay, and one other item which is very relevant these days in terms of exchanging your funds, there are some very sophisticated, I shouldn't say very sophisticated, but there are certain financial instruments which you can use to deal with something with today's reality. In other words, if you have US dollars, so unfortunately the currency is very weak right now, right? Like I checked it today, I think the rate is what, 3.43 or something. So as opposed to, where it was a few months ago and a few years ago. So the US dollar is very weak. If you're Canadian, you have savings in Canada, unfortunately like me, so the Canadian dollar is doing terrible against the shekel. Okay, so basically like this. There's something, if you transfer your money over and convert it now, so you're going to get these, unfortunately, pretty bad exchange rates because the shekel is really, really strong. Now, if you believe that the Canadian dollar or the US dollar is going to strengthen, so you have something called a swap, okay? And what is a swap? It's not for everybody, but basically what it allows you to do is it allows you to you transfer your dollars over into Israel. And let's say you do this only with one of these foreign exchange companies. Really only Forex Israel does this, as far as I'm aware. But what they do is that they will give you shekels for your dollars, okay? They swap you your dollars for their shekels. They're not converting your dollars first. They're just swapping with you. What that means is that they're still holding your dollars. They're giving you some shekels in the meantime, and they're making your payments for you to your seller or to your builder. But they hang on to 10% roughly of your funds, and you use that as margin so that you can actually convert your funds at a later date. Okay, so for example, if you have US dollars, you transfer over, let's say $100,000. Forex Israel will take $90,000 and they'll give you the shekel equivalent of that. They'll hang on to 10%. And then what you do is one day in the near future, they're really usually, swap contracts are usually for about 3 months. So let's say over the next 3 months, let's say the US dollar jumps from 3.44 to 3.6. So when that happens, you tell Forex Israel, you want to convert your funds at that 3.6. So what they do is they're holding $10,000 only of yours, but they really convert that whole $100,000 amount at that 3.6 exchange rate. So you're really getting 360,000 shekels, okay? And by doing it like that, what you're essentially allowing yourself to do is you are accessing your funds immediately. You can make your payments immediately without being forced to convert your funds at that time. Okay, you can actually get access to the shekels now, but convert your funds at a later date. Okay, the only downside is that there's a risk. The risk is that if the US dollar continues to drop, so then you'll convert your funds and the contract runs out, the swap contract runs out, and if at that time the exchange rate is 3.3, so unfortunately you'd be stuck with only 330,000 shekels, and that's the risk. Okay. Okay, we have a question here. What do banks typically charge for a conversion fee? Or is the issue that they give a lower exchange rate? Very good. Okay, so the thing is that when you get a quote from a bank, they really have 3 different ways that they really charge you on their conversion. They will tell you, they'll basically charge you, number 1, a cost to receive the funds. They'll charge you a conversion fee, and then they'll give you a rate that's different. Then they'll give you a rate that's lower than the actual market rate. Okay, so it's very hard to compare apples to apples. Okay, the bottom line though is if you factor in all their fees together, my experience is you lose around 1.5 shekels. Sorry, 1.5%. Okay, okay. So if you're converting $100,000 and you're doing it through an Israeli bank, so it could be that you'd be losing around $1,500 just on the conversion. Okay. Whereas if you use one of these, and that's when you build, if you add in all these fees and you do the math, that's what it comes out to. Now you can negotiate with these banks also. Okay. So, and they'll come down on that. And theoretically, there's some banks that will, in some cases, come down as low as, I don't know, I've seen maybe like 0.6%, 0.5% in some cases, which is basically the rate that the foreign exchange companies will give you. Okay, and the foreign exchange companies, at least the ones that I recommend, are usually the ones that they'll usually just give you one number. Okay, they'll quote you like 0.5%, and it's really just 0.5% off the mid rate, or they'll tell you they'll take 2 agorot off the rate. In other words, if the rate is 3.43, they'll give you 3.41, and there's no further math that you have to figure out. Okay. Okay, very good. Good question. It's a good Jewish question. How is ribis dealt with in Israel with Jewish banks? Okay, so can anyone guess? Okay, again, you're muted, so you can't answer. Okay, so the answer is you have a, can you say it? Heter iska, right. So there are halakhic ways to get around the whole idea of ribis, and all the Israeli banks have heter iskas. Okay, so it's that's how they get around it. So for anyone who finds it acceptable to use a heter iska, so you can essentially access mortgage funds from any Israeli bank. Okay. Yeah, just to summarize in general with mortgages, it's well worth your while to really research the mortgages really well and to really understand them well. If you're using a mortgage broker, so your mortgage broker will go through, your situation in a really, detailed way, please God. But it's kind of like this, if you overpay for a falafel, you pay, on Ben Yehuda Street, so maybe you got ripped off by like 3 shekels. But in terms of a mortgage, so if you overpay for a mortgage, so it can really cost you, tens of thousands of extra shekels that you didn't have to really spend money on, okay? Or in some cases, much more. There's also many mortgages in Israel. This is a big, big warning if you're planning to do the mortgage yourself. There are many mortgages in Israel that unfortunately have hidden costs, okay, linked to the Israeli inflation index, and they'll quote you one number, but there's a hidden cost associated with it. So you can definitely get mortgages that don't have these hidden costs, but you have to really, really be very, very sure of what you're getting, because these mortgages with hidden costs are terribly expensive over the long term. And they actually have mortgages in Israel. I love this country, I love Eretz Israel, but I have to tell you, some of the mortgages are terrible. Okay, so it's there are mortgages where you can be paying into it for years, and believe it or not, you can actually find that your mortgage balance actually goes up over time. Okay, so it's a very serious thing. So you have to really make sure that you don't get into one of these terrible mortgages. Okay, but if you get into the right type of mortgage, as I started off by saying, the mortgages here are actually really great because you have your choice of currency. You can do part fixed, part variable. You can really tailor your mortgage to, to the situation that to your own personal financial profile. Okay, so if you have any other questions, you can put them in the chat now. Just see if there's any more. We do have a couple more questions. Okay. Okay, thanks for the translation. Ribis equals interest. Thank you, Yudis. Okay, can you repay early without penalty? Okay, so basically like this, you can designate, I addressed it shortly before, just to summarize, when you repay your mortgage, so you can designate, if you're just repaying part of your mortgage, so you can designate which part of your mortgage you want to pay. Do you want to pay the variable part, the fixed part, the dollar part, the shekel part? You can choose which part you prepay. If you're prepaying the variable part, so there's no penalty. If you're prepaying the fixed part of your mortgage, then there's a penalty only if the interest rates have dropped from when you took out your mortgage initially. Okay. All right, thank you very much. And batzlacha, please God, the process should be successful for you, and you should get your property in Eretz Yisrael. You should enjoy, and feel free to be in touch if you have any questions.